Hello, and welcome back to TPI's podcast, To Think Minimum. I'm Chris McGurn, TPI's Director of Communications. Each week on this podcast, we facilitate a conversation between TPI fellows and special guests on some of the most pressing and important issues in tech policy and tech politics. Today we have with us Rob Pegoraro, who is a tech journalist of long standing in the DC area and has been covering technology and the intersection of technology and politics for close to about 20 years now, if not longer. We're happy to have him with us, given that he's one of Washingtonian's tech titans from 2015 to 2017. And he would be the perfect guest to have in to talk about the evolution of tech in DC over the past 10 years, because TPI is also celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. Without further ado, I want to welcome in also TPI's Research Fellow and Scott Walston, TPI's Senior Fellow and President, to have a conversation with Rob on all things tech and policy. So, Rob, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Scott and Sarah, feel free to jump in whenever you want. One question I wanted to get right off the bat is, with all the talk this week about Mark Zuckerberg on the Hill and Facebook, kind of being dragged before the hearings in the House and the Senate.
I thought he just came to D.C. for the cherry blossoms. Was I misinformed?
He should have.
He usually does, yeah.
Okay.
It's how he likes to spend his time.
Yeah, I ran into him at Potbelly's for lunch, actually. So you've been covering this space for a long time. Where have you seen some of the big trends that jump in your mind? If someone says, in the last 10 years of tech, what jumps out at you?
So the last 10 years, I guess, because it used to be there was just no connection at all. And then Microsoft in the 1990s. And then after that, Google sort of learned that lesson a bit, and they've staffed up and now have a lot of office space around town. Facebook has gone in that same progression. The first Facebook office I met anybody at in D.C. was an upper floor in a townhome around DuPont Circle that had been converted into offices. And they moved to a slightly larger space, I think around like 9th and F, 14th and F. And I can only imagine how many people they have based in D.C. now and are working in D.C. full time. So it's like there's this, I guess you don't need to do it by the time of your Series A fundraising round, but,
right.
But definitely by the round after that, if you have anything that involves data, you should have somebody in D.C.
And also it's important that you have enough money to make an office with distressed wood and
yeah, you got to have it. It's got to show up in a little, profile somewhere, exactly. Washingtonian or whatever. People do that. Now the question is, are these companies, are they just trying to sort of make sure laws they don't like don't get passed? Are they trying to advocate for change? Like we mentioned Google, a lot of their time is, they like to have their advertising business free to run as they wish. They've also advocated for measures to ensure that the government cannot go grab your email by asking nicely for it.
Let me ask, since we started off by talking about Zuckerberg's appearance, Facebook does have a fairly big operation here now, as you'd expect, given their size. What is that office doing now with respect to Zuckerberg? And I assume, their biggest job would have been to make sure he doesn't appear at all. But that's probably never an option in this case.
If he does appear, make sure they don't have the picture of him raising his right hand,
Right. So what do you think is going on?
A lot of what they've done, they're in a unique position because I guess it's Facebook and Twitter. The other reason to have a DC office is just marketing, lead generation. Mm-hmm. Get people to use your platform. Get people to show up on Twitter. You never know what promising presidential candidate will make Twitter his own unique platform in a way that no one has done before, and hopefully no one ever will afterwards. That's historically been part of their job as well. And like Google, they don't quite need to sell the product to individual senators and representatives the way Facebook and Twitter will. Yeah, otherwise, one thing I'd love to see is how the workflow for somebody who works for Facebook differs if they're based here or in Brussels, because the EU has a totally different privacy environment. Like they actually have meaningful regulation about privacy. Some might say it's too much, but at least it exists. Whereas here outside,
Facebook has to operate with a choice. Right?
Exactly. If you deal with the data of EU residents, then you got to play ball by the rules.
Yeah, and not only between DC and Brussels, but we sort of have this ongoing conversation in this office that the DC folks for these major companies are not always looked at in the highest regard from headquarters back, in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think that comes back to originally DC kind of held off on tech and they didn't really go after them. And now, like you mentioned, Microsoft and Google, they're starting to realize that they do actually have to play this game as well. And I think that kind of a lot of the people in the idealistic, ground zero of these companies really the wrong way. So it's interesting to see the dynamic between the DC office and the headquarters folks when they come into town.
I remember very much going to a tech policy event, the Tech Policy Summit in 2012. It was at this lovely resort in Napa. Great conference all around. And at one point, one of these idealistic libertarian Silicon Valley types is saying, we just want government to leave us alone. And it was me and the late great Stephen Wildsworth of Business Week were there. And Steve was like, that's not going to work. The people whose industries you're trying to disrupt, they're not going to leave you alone. And they're really good at working the refs. So if you want to make the change, in the market you want to see happen, then you had better get familiar with flights to the DC area from the Bay Area.
Do you think they're sort of reaping some of the consequences of not paying sufficient attention? Or have they sort of steadily been getting better?
Facebook, it's sort of hard to read because in some areas, like I compare how they handle the traditional definition of information security. Are you the person who should be logging into the account? How can we make sure no one is impersonating you? And they've been pretty good at that. They've hired very good people. They have a good two-step verification system. They take steps to ensure that even if you're on an old Android phone, they're not going to just accept any random login. But if you're on a social network, InfoSec can only be in terms of authentication. And then once you're on, it's all good. And so the way they've responded to what you could call social engineering at scale has not been as astute and smart and appropriately cynical. And so you've seen some of that in the recent testimony Facebook has said, well, we were an idealistic company. Yeah, you were, but you should be aware that bad people use the internet too. Yeah. And Twitter's done the same thing. And a lot of it also goes into when you look at how Twitter has responded to harassment on their platform. A lot of the systems they've done, I've seen this as a white dude using Twitter. You can write mean things about Gamergate. People don't actually issue you death threats. They talk endlessly. Gamergaters cannot shut up. The internet issue, this was this argument like 3 years ago about how video game journalism was unfair, which weirdly enough got tied up with people who also thought like women and minorities should not offer any value judgments about games at all. And if you're a woman or a minority and you talk about these issues, then you have a different experience. And you have to think that if more people doing the basic architecture of these systems realize what it was like to be swarmed by a bunch of people, they might design them in a different way.
So do you think they had any response to the problem that was sufficient given the magnitude of the problem? Or did they just ignore it?
Wait, are we talking Facebook or Twitter?
Well, I guess which
social networks are we failing?
Well, which one did you think the problem was worse on?
You could say in this case Facebook, because it involves not just, we're sort of used to people being jerks or malicious on one platform or another for money to rip somebody off because they're bigoted. To have it be part of a nation state's campaign is something like, I hadn't really thought about that. That's sort of new in my experience. And that's where Facebook's initial response to Cambridge Analytica is awful. They found out that, first of all, they designed a system where you could write an app and it could make a really big request for your data. It could scoop up your friends' data. And it was all based on, we'll kick bad actors off the platform. That is a very brittle system and it's going to fail. And it did fail. And when they found out, this guy, Alexander Kogan, posted this personality quiz app, then he handed the data to a third party, explicitly in violation of the rules. Did they name and shame him? Did they alert the users who got, ripped off in this way? No. And this was after they'd signed a 20-year settlement regime with the Federal Trade Commission. So that's where, somebody in the DC office should have told somebody in the Bay Area office, you cannot just let this go. That's where they should have taken action. And
of course, it's conceivable they did and were ignored.
Right. Well, I think at this point they would have told us. The fact that
you're right.
They shook their fist at Cambridge Analytica, said, you have to give us your word, you'll delete this data. Really, they didn't have that many rules, but it was very clear. You can't say you're posting a quiz for this reason, and then you're going to use your app for a totally different one. And that's the point where I've had some, I guess they're fans of the current president, say, well, the Obama campaign did the same thing. No, they didn't. It was explicitly an app from the Obama campaign, help re-elect the president. It wasn't, what Sex and the City character are you? And, oh, by the way, do you like President Obama?
So all campaigns use sophisticated data analysis, and the Hillary Clinton's campaign was going to unveil their sophisticated system of analytics after she won the election. And of course,
I'd still like to see happen. That PowerPoint.
Exactly. So was that the fundamental difference, that they thought that they had a misleading way of getting the data, or that they used the data to target misleading information?
Well, in the Facebook rules context, and also just basic, ethics, and even like, U.S. law, you can't, if you say you're going to use data for a reason and use it for another one, that can get you in trouble with the FTC. Not quickly, slowly. And in the Facebook context as well. If you post an app, you can't have a Trojan horse app that asks for all these personal details and then gets handed off to somebody's marketing machine. So yeah, I don't know why they didn't do more. Maybe they sent a really, really vituperative email to the Cambridge people and we just haven't seen it yet. Given the pace at which things have been leaking out of Facebook lately, I don't think there's, if there was stuff that was going to make them look better, they would have brought that out already.
So do you think it was an issue that they really didn't understand that there was an underlying problem, that they just assumed since people are volunteering photos and location and everything else, that it's pretty much open market for everyone's personal data, and they just didn't really
I was
care.
comparing an email with somebody the other day. If you installed an app on an Android phone a few years ago, you would see this, list of permissions when you installed it. And it was yes or no. If you don't like the permissions, then don't install the app. And you had to sort of make the snap judgment right then. Do you trust this app to get all this information or not? And they realized that was a broken system as well. And so now an Android app, it has to ask for permission when it wants to do something like turn on the camera or turn on the microphone or access your location. And you can decline that permission. And the app may break. If it's written for an older version of Android, it probably will, which they introduced this in 2015. So certain app developers, Snapchat, should really get on the ball with that. The idea that you're going to expect everyday people to look at this list of requests for access to your data and think, well, let me Google this company, have any of my friends install this. When Facebook system at the time, even back then on Android, you could see these are the other apps from this developer in the same Play Store screen. Getting that sort of index of, is this a trustworthy application on Facebook? It's bad. The interface is not helpful.
One of the things that I'm struggling with is trying to figure out where exactly is the harm and whether it's that it's more just sort of a violation of trust as opposed to measurable harm, or that in fact this data was then used to target misinformation. And that's a sort of a different kettle of fish, but a really big one.
Yeah, my answer to that one might be yes. Because on the one hand, if you find that somebody got information out of you under false pretenses, like, sure, I'll vote in an online poll at some blog. That's fine. I know what I'm doing. But duplicity is not cool. It may not be illegal. It may or may not violate the rules of a social platform, but that is not how a company that wants to be around for the long term, a developer that wants to be around for the long term should treat the customer. But then, if you then use that and you use this to prey on people's prejudices, feed them disinformation, I'm trying to use that word because it relates to Soviet propaganda. I'm a child of the 80s. And fake news has gotten ruined because President Trump uses that to describe news that is mean to me.
Exactly, right.
I also struggle with this as well because you said false pretenses and trust, and these are fuzzy concepts because it's hard for me to believe that they didn't know that people could use this data wrongly. It's a lot of data. It's personal data. They're scooping it up. Uber has all the data that where we go. YouTube has all my data of what I watch. So I think that's the gray area, the trust. And I don't know about legislating rules for trust. How do you make Mark Zuckerberg more trustworthy with your data?
It's a big question. I mean, what of the things that people have been discussing as remedies actually would be?
Yeah, I mean, you would think that just in terms of self-defense against the inevitable data breach, data minimization is a good principle to write by. Don't get more information than you need. At least as if this was the case as of last weekend, Facebook's guidance to app developers and people using Facebook login explicitly said that. Don't ask for more data than you need. Our research has shown people are more inclined to trust you if you don't make this laundry list request. But then I guess if you're a startup, if you have all this data already, it just makes it easier for the inevitable pivot when the first business model goes bust. Yeah. But you got your customer list, you got the data.
You're feeding your AI algorithms with as much data as you can give it.
And those are also, I mean, you're talking about, let's say, legitimate uses. If you're Cambridge Analytica, the data you need is all of it.
Yeah.
Because it's not clear that you have good objections.
So I think we're going to be talking about this for the next 10, 20
So I have to ask about Cambridge. Like I did check the page Facebook put up to see was your data fed to their system by you or any of your friends. And it said for me, no. Which I was thinking, like, back then, some of my cousins and friends on Facebook will click on anything. So I really thought I would have gotten swept up. Did any of you all get...
No, I didn't.
Okay, good.
Well, maybe that's good. I mean, if we assume that the tool is working, then that's good.
Right. Well, the tool should definitely say if that one app collected your information. But back then, the entire friend permissions API, which was... that name was irrelevant because it was all about not getting permission from your friends. Your permission was, I'm on Facebook, so it's okay if my friend can install this stupid app and collect, I guess, whatever information I left public at the time.
I mean, part of the problem seems to be that, sharing data was the whole point of Facebook in the first place. And so figuring out how to not share data goes against their DNA.
Yeah.
And I just remember going back to the, 10-year sort of theme. 10 years ago, it was still the Facebook, and it was used primarily by college students. So lonely college guys could see the cute girls and actually figure out where they lived and their phone numbers and things. And I know that because...
So it started off creepy and roommates?
Exactly. My brother was at DW at the
time,
and they had the beta test of the college version of Facebook before it was unrolled in like 2006, 2007. And just the way it's gone from that very simple connecting people, knowing where they are, compared to what it is today. It's just, it shows that, there are always these unintended, people I don't think would have realized that Facebook would have turned into what it became. And now where it goes from here is, I think, another question that no one really has the answer to.
Well, part of the power of Facebook is its scale. It's not the design. So it's the fact that so many eyeballs are watching it that they can target advertisements that have impact. If Facebook was like Friendster, it wouldn't be a big deal, but it's because of the scale.
I heard the name Friendster for a while.
Yeah, was that even still around 10 years ago? I guess it was.
I don't know. It might have been MySpace.
Or
I remember.
A small network.
Facebook have to mention that. I mean, if we didn't have something like it now, we'd have to invent something like it, because it really is useful for me to stay in touch with people who are not in the same place as me, who, are not necessarily going to be an email, who are not going to be on Twitter. Like, it's nice to see baby pictures from across the country or across the Atlantic Ocean. It's really handy to be able to see, I'm in San Francisco, who's around this weekend. So,
and the targeting ad targeting has real benefits too. So
my mom, unsolicited, said, I like how the fact the ads get that I'm really into old English houses and gardening and whatnot. Unsolicited praise for Facebook advertising.
Well,
there you go.
Well, the recommendation engines, that's all AI. Netflix is telling you what you would like to watch next. Amazon's telling you, would you like this product? Yeah. Probably.
Yeah, Amazon, they got to work on theirs. Their retargeting is really, I did a column for USA Today, I think 2 years ago, because I live in an older house. I need to buy a toilet seat. I thought, well, what's the price for that on Amazon? So do that. 2 days later, I was taking a screenshot of a story of mine, and there was an ad for a toilet seat. I'm like, let me reload the page. Toilet seat. Toilet seat. I'm like, Amazon, I live in a small house. I replace the toilet seat maybe this is not a frequent purchase item. I'm not collecting these things. So I wrote a column like how to turn off Amazon ad retargeting.
That would be great to know for any husband and wife or spousal teams that share a Facebook account.
Yeah.
I have tried buying gifts, and my wife will come in and be like, you really think that's the right color on me? Or, whatever it is. Like, come on, Amazon.
I also like that they seem to want to put everything on their dash buttons. Like you would want to have a toilet seat programmed onto your dash button. For the toilet seat. I want to ask about a sort of a different topic. I mean, it's related to a platform still, but maybe haven't heard the phrase in a while, but we talked about living in a gig economy. And
freelancers, tell me about it.
Exactly. So that's what I wanted to ask you. In principle, this economy should have moved in a way that's really beneficial to you because you already knew how to work it. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but now they have more tools. But on the other hand, you also work in news. So how have these two trends worked out for you?
The best insight I got was from a couple of papers I read a year or two ago. It's best to think of this as two gig economies. One is the sort of differentiated one where your product is distinct from someone else's. So hopefully, I'll admit that some of my posts and stories are just replacement level, but I try to provide value above replacement level. But, if you drive for a Lyft or an Uber, you can get a 5-star rating, but it doesn't really give you an edge. Like I asked Uber at one point, if there are two drivers that are half a mile away from me, one of them I gave a 5-star rating to, the other one I gave a 4-star rating. Does that factor into who gets to drive me to my next place? And they were like, no. And at the time, Uber didn't even let you tip, so that you were really alienated from the means of from your own labor, I guess, to phrase as Marxist-like as possible. And so you have gig economy platforms where you're not, it's not you, it's just a service will appear when you press a button on your phone. But that doesn't really help you out later on. But if you're an artist, if you you do some kind of individual labor, you make something where it is actually you, the person, then you can do pretty well. I mean, there are lots of other ways the gig economy is not so great since it's tax time. I'd like to note that tax code is not super friendly. We'll see what it is next year. I'm going to get that 20% break on my 1099 income. Of course, it'll probably be offset by the fact that living in Virginia, I will not be able to, the state tax and the property tax, that all goes away.
Less in Virginia than in Maryland or D.C.
Or New Jersey, or California, where my in-laws live.
So are you on net, do you think, a beneficiary of recent changes, or because you're in the news, does it outweigh by the problems in the news
crappy state of the news business?
Exactly.
I think it's worked out okay for me. Like I have came into this with a lot of unfair advantages. The number one thing that has helped me out as a freelancer is if you want to get a good start in freelance journalism, write a technology column for a major American newspaper for 11 years, as I did for the Washington Post. Then leave when no one expects. Boom! It's a great big one ad, which I didn't realize it, until it actually happened.
I've had a quick question. So, as a tech journalist, who are the tech journalists that you look to? Like, you want to get to the bottom of the story or write something? Or do you have like a list of your top like 2 or 3 names of people that you always go to? So
there's a handful. I'll give you like names and sites, for instance. So for like tech policy, one site I've been reading for a long time is techdirt.com. This guy, Mike Masnick, covers it. He's been writing about issues like intellectual property and privacy and whatnot. And he's Bay Area based, and he actually gets how things happen and don't happen around DC. So, and he's been way ahead of the game on a lot of issues, and he doesn't always write arguments that change people's minds because people are stubborn around here. Ars Technica is a great site just for general purpose tech coverage, but they're also really sharp on tech policy. They've got a great guy, John Brodkin, who covers telecom policy and the FCC. Like, I cannot hope to keep up with him. Sean Gallagher does some great information security coverage there. Brian Krebs, an old coworker of mine for the Post, he is the dean of cybersecurity journalists. So if you're going to come to an opposite conclusion than he has on something, you'd best have done your research.
Do you see demand for tech journalism increasing, or is it about constant?
Yeah, a year and a half ago, we didn't have Axios, the site founded by the ex-Politico types, and they've done a lot of really good hiring, like Ina Fried in the Bay Area, Scott Rosenberg, who has been writing about this stuff. I remember reading him at like Salon.com in the late 90s. Really knows his stuff. They have my old Post colleague Kim Hart editing their tech coverage.
What do you think of Axios? I have mixed feelings because on the one hand, they're great people, like you said, and they get good stories. On the other hand, I sort of don't like the idea that news is moving to a 3-sentence format.
Right. Well, I like Twitter, so I have no
good point.
One sentence.
Yeah. When they came out, it was hard to read because the only faces of it were, like Mike Allen and the other Politico types. And Allen, another guy I used to work with at the Post, he could be sort of hard to read sometimes. Like their first time I remember seeing other people talking about them was when Allen went to some event at Mar-a-Lago before the inauguration. And he was tweeting out pictures of the spread, and we're all like, really, Mike? This is kind of gross, even by Access journalism standards. But since then, they've been doing a very good job of trying to figure out what's going on in this White House.
Yeah, and I think that Axios in particular, kind of took the Mike Allen approach of your bread and butter is the daily newsletter. I mean, you can read all the 3 sentences tweets that you want, but if you want to really digest the news, you need to either get the morning or afternoon ones. So, Ina, as you mentioned, her tech newsletter, I've sent around a lot of stuff to this office. Mike Allen, I read his stuff just to keep on top of what's going on here. But it's way too shattering trying to keep up with it on like a day-to-day, second-by-second
Do you see it, though, as as kind of a change in the type of business model that's likely to succeed now, or is it just its own niche that...
So, news business models do need work. I mean, that's one big change that's happened over the last 10 years because online ads, that industry, I don't know if it's their fault, but they're not providing enough financial support. And in some ways, online ads are outright harming newspapers when you see how often just the amount of crap that gets onto ad networks, the forced redirect ad where suddenly you're looking at a $100 gift card offer that has taken you off the page entirely. And if you take them up on that, it's some kind of multi-level marketing fraud. And the ad industry doesn't seem to be cleaning up its own act very well. So subscriptions they've worked well for the Washington Post. They've worked well for the New York Times. What I worry about is smaller papers like, Denver. The Denver Post is currently getting throttled to death by a hedge fund in New York that seems to have no concept of how to run a newspaper, why a newspaper would exist. And, I feel very bad for people who work there, for people who live in Denver who deserve somebody who will tell them what's going on.
What you're saying is, that's consistent with the research I've seen on changes in media, that for national and international news, their papers are struggling. Some papers are struggling, but basically we're doing fine. There's plenty of information. There's news sources. But for state and local, it's decimated.
Yeah, exactly. And having grown up in New Jersey and living in Virginia now, I can tell you a lot of nonsense goes on at state houses. You want to have somebody watching what's going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. So I have a subscription to the Post, your former employer. And in order to get the best deal for the digital access, I get the Sunday paper broken up into Saturday and Sunday. And I usually toss the dead tree version and just keep the bags because we have a dog. And that way I can, keep it. So I'm not sure.
You get some value out of it.
I get some great value out of it. But I mean, again, I think it's just so that they can say that their physical circulation is a certain number.
I don't even think it's that. I mean, you can make more money off print ads than online, which is not how it's supposed to be. The idea you can target people really precisely. It turns out Facebook can, Google can. They're doing well at that. The newspapers, and a lot of it is their own fault. Like there's tons of missed opportunities. The San Jose Mercury News had a chance to buy Craigslist. So there's so many steps that could have been taken. Yeah, it's irritating.
Like Western Union agreeing not to get into telephony.
Yeah.
The Post, when I was there, we wasted like 2-3 years. Someone had the idea that the web is too hard. We're going to run our own online service. It was amazing. We only lost like $50 million on this horrible digital link thing, which was like, AOL, if the quick pace of logging in on AOL bothered you, stressed you out too much, digital link would put you right at ease. Yeah, and I think people don't want to be stupid. I think there is a market to inform people. But it's just getting over that hump and finding other business models, whether it's subscriptions, hosting events, some kinds of digital journalism like podcasts. Apparently you get really good CPMs on those ads. People listen to them. People don't hate them. They haven't been infected by horrible ad networks.
I wonder why. Do you think it's because people have already self-selected into their interest?
I guess it's just some of it. I guess just because of the way you record a podcast, programmatic ad insertion is not as easy as it is on a page that's put together dynamically.
Mm-hmm. That's good to know since we're on a podcast now.
Right.
We'll have to monetize it.
Well, that's all I have. Anything else that you want to talk about while we're here?
I guess, we can't sort of ignore how Washington has looked at the tech industry, because for years, there was no expectation that DC could do anything really great. So the attitude among tech policy types who were paying attention was, let's stop the horrible stuff. Let's stop the Communications Decency Act from reducing the internet to something only fit for children. Let's stop the Stop Online Piracy Act from totally breaking basic internet routing architecture. And we've gotten to the point where some good bills can advance. The USA Freedom Act curtailed bulk surveillance by the government. On the other hand, some stuff, I had too much fun writing a story for Yahoo for Groundhog Day about how many years we've gone without reforming the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is a joke of a law that no one even tries to use. It's the one that says, if mail is stored more than 180 days, then you can just subpoena it. You don't need to get a warrant or anything. And fortunately, all the major providers have seized on one circuit court ruling and said, no, you really need a warrant. But even then, where it's obvious the law is a joke, no one pays attention. Year after year, it goes unfixed.
Is this because of partisanship, or are there other factors?
Some of it, like the SEC has sort of opposed relaxing that because they want to be able to go after, various crooks on Wall Street. But it's silly. If something passes on a voice vote in the House, probably you should be able to advance that forward. But it's just no one has really championed it, and I certainly don't expect anything to happen on that in this Congress.
Well, it's hard to expect much of anything to happen.
Yeah, they have the omnibus bill, so it's like now we're just going to try to not lose our elections.
But it used to be the case when tech was only telecom that the issues, they were hard fought, but they weren't necessarily partisan. Things, they were fought along maybe industry lines. I'm not really sure. And then with net neutrality, it sort of all became much more partisan. And has that sort of transferred into broader tech policy, do you think?
Net neutrality is weird because I am not a both sides guy. Some of it is overheated on both sides. Like the idea that Verizon, which I should note owns Yahoo and therefore Yahoo Finance, is going to start censoring political speech so that their subscribers can't see it. It's not going to happen.
Right.
There isn't even a business model for that. On the other hand, the pro-net neutrality people talking about regulating the internet, is the Food and Drug Administration regulating my stomach? That's not how it works. We had this discussion around the time of Teddy Roosevelt. It's okay to have government saying, you must have some standards in an industry. And comparing it to socialism or, the way China runs its internet, it's ridiculous.
So basically, totally overwrought.
Yeah.
No matter who you're talking about.
Yeah. And that's one where Ajit Pai has done some good things with robocalls as FCC chair, but his crusade about restoring things to the way they were back then this is unlocking the internet and American innovation. Well, like I was covering the FCC in the late 90s, and we had really strict regulation of DSL broadband. And in his view of history, that just didn't happen.
Well, except that cable was not regulated the same way.
Cable, they never quite figured out what to do with it. Yeah, I don't know. Net neutrality, at this point, I feel like I've been covering it for so long. Like, you could do it Oxford debate style. Tell me to advocate for it or against it. I could probably do a decent job either way.
I feel you. I first wrote about it in 2006, and it hasn't gotten more interesting.
Yeah.
And that brings up another topic, which maybe isn't interesting, but really bothers me. What do you think about the way regulations and laws are titled these days? Like the Internet Freedom Act, Open Internet Order, go back to the Patriot Act. They're titled to obscure debate.
Well, SEO is a thing. I was writing about data breaches the other day, and there's a discussion draft of a bill, and I can't remember its name because it doesn't have some snappy acronym like the Puppies Act.
Interesting.
So,
because I go back and look at some of the old ones, and it'll be like the most boring title ever, and I'll think, yeah that's something I want to read.
Yeah, there's a great one, actually. The now departing former Representative Blake Farenthold had a bill that would basically clarify that, you're allowed to tinker with stuff, gadgets you own. It was the You Own Devices Act, YODA Act.
Oh, man, that's
great
awesome.
work by whatever staffer came up with that. Of course, it went nowhere, like all good tech policy bills.
So they did try and didn't do.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you for coming in. I think we're wrapping up our time here. I feel like we just scratched the surface here. So I'm going to, on behalf of Two Think Minimum, invite you back at some point. We can continue this conversation.
Well, thanks for coming by.
Yeah, thanks for coming by.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.